Check Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw, coming to you as always from the Check News World Headquarters here in Victoria. Healthcare, LNG, a new special advisor to the Premier, a whole bunch more to delve into this week, including podcast audio extras. So if you're watching us on YouTube or Check Plus or Check TV, make sure you subscribe to the audio podcast for an extended discussion with the Pod Squad, who we are going to bring in now. Jeff, Jillian, Allie are all here to break down the week in BC politics and explain it to us. Thank you, as always, for being here and walking us through this. We should start with healthcare. We talk about it pretty much every week. Polls show the continued hospital ER closures and wait times and doctor and nursing shortages and ambulance problems are still top of mind for voters. The province says it needs more money from Ottawa. Ottawa says you can have it with strings. They've been apart on this issue for a while, but it now looks like the Prime Minister will sit down with the premiers on February 7th. Jeff, are we closer to a deal? What do we make of this kind of movement that's occurred here?
Yeah, I think we're really close to a deal. I think it's dotting I's and crossing T's. And when you have the federal government and all kinds of provinces together in a room, sometimes the dotting and the crossing can get in the way of a deal at the last minute. But I think we're really close. There's a lot of momentum behind the scenes for this happening. I think it's significant that the Prime Minister and the Premier are meeting on the 1st. I think it's significant for Eby because it's an opportunity for him to be seen as fighting for British Columbia for those health dollars. And I think it's significant for Trudeau, though, as well. And I've had some words for him and his approach on this because these kinds of meetings position Ottawa as committed to solutions instead of just the source of all of the problems. But the most significant meetings that are happening right now are happening away from the cameras. It's Ottawa and the provinces making real progress on the health funding. I would be shocked if it's not announced in the next 7 days. And that's going to be a big, important investment that will benefit people across Canada and here in British Columbia.
If you do the math on it, Allie, I think there's like 20 some odd $billion spent a year in healthcare in BC. If the feds do lift up their share to 35%, it adds another $4 billion a year, which is not an insignificant amount. It's an entire, new revenue stream compared to some of the revenue streams the province gets. How significant is that, and how close do you think everyone is now at this point?
It's true. The largest part of our provincial budget actually goes to healthcare as well. I think it's important to remind people, though, that despite if it comes from municipal, provincial, or federal, this is still taxpayer dollars. And this is an investment that we all are going to be making into something that matters the most right now. So I think when it comes to how much it's going to increase, this is what we as Canadians have also just been asking for. So usually I am the one to say, the budget's huge, like this is awful. Not with this one. People are dying. People are waiting for their surgeries. We have a shortage of nurses and paramedics. So as taxpayer dollars, we are all committed to making sure that we are solutions oriented in this discussion.
There was some sticking points, Jillian, it sounded like from the beginning of Ottawa wants some of the money to go to different things, specific things in provinces, and then also health data to be compiled in a way that can be used nationally to sort of measure the outcomes of how things are going. The provinces balked at that, but then they appear to have found a way to say they think they're doing that anyways, and they're fine with that allocation. Is that compromise make a lot of sense to BC, do you think?
I think it does. It makes sense that, if the feds are going to be shelling out such a massive amount of money, that they would want to see where it's going. I think it's, less, maybe a little bit less pertinent in BC, where you have, more of a progressive government than, I think Ottawa's main concern was with more conservative provinces, keeping other taxes low and kind of just using the federal coffers, while getting all the political advantage on both ends. But yeah, I think it does sound this week you hear from, it sounds like from what the premiers and the prime minister are saying, that they've found a way to share that data. I think that's good. I think, we're starting to see provinces, start to compete with one another for healthcare workers and for all of these things. And I think that we, need to recognize that this needs to be a shared approach across the country, because we're all Canadians and we all benefit when we're all healthy. And I think that it's good to have some more transparency and a little bit more standardization to make sure that we're not seeing that sort of overly competitive behavior, which will leave some provinces far less well off than others. And I think the federal government has a role to play in kind of making sure that there's a little bit of accountability on that front.
We'll see what the bilateral deals look like. BC, I believe, is looking to earmark some of the money for seniors care and for mental health and addiction. So we could look for significant improvements, hopefully, in those areas. And mental health and addiction is a big priority of Premier David Eby now. So he'll have some more money to put into the treatment side or that kind of emphasis. So yeah, we will, I'm sure, talk about the actual deal and the mechanics when it comes out. The Premier is also meeting the Prime Minister in Ottawa next week as well. Let us jump on to a different topic here, liquefied natural gas. We don't really talk about it that often, but it was not that long ago that the mere mention of the $40 billion LNG Canada project in Kitimat was top of mind for the NDP government. Premier John Horgan offered a $6 billion tax break to get that project to a positive investment decision in 2018, the single largest private project in Canadian history with $20 billion in revenue over the lifetime to the province and thousands of jobs. Now LNG Canada very recently is talking about expanding to phase 2, and you hear nothing from the NDP. Crickets, a total lack of enthusiasm from Premier David Eby when I asked him about it this week. What is going on here on this reversal, and what do you think of the province's position, Jillian? Let's start with you.
Well, this really kicked off because LNG Canada came out and said, we're not getting what we need from the province to electrify. We're going to run this new phase on natural gas, which, means higher emissions. I think that what they're doing is they're basically trying to force the government's hand to give them the electrification that they want, which is really, another subsidy to help keep their costs down. They still haven't made a final investment decision about the second phase, although they do have all the permits and approvals that they need to go forward with it. So it's an interesting question for the government. LNG Canada is basically threatening Clean BC and threatening the climate targets and trying to get what they want because they know that there's a lot of competition for electrification. There's lots of mines that are producing resources that can be used in real renewable energy like solar panels, and things like that. There's a lot of different industries that are wanting those transmission lines, and there's a finite amount. So LNG Canada is trying to play hardball. They think that's the best way to get what they want. And the government kind of has to decide, are they going to call LNG Canada's bluff and say, we're not going to give you another subsidy and risk them going ahead and blowing up the climate plan, or are they going to go ahead and make that difficult decision, which comes at a cost to other industries that also need the electrification to help meet their climate targets. That might be, even cleaner industries. So it's an interesting one. It sounds like the government is leaning towards to calling that bluff and hoping that they're not going to go ahead with the FID. But it's a risk, and it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out.
Just sticking with you, Jillian, do we have any better read now on where David Eby is on climate initiatives, and can we extrapolate anything from what he has said so far to where he would be on this project? It feels like he's more concerned about that area than the resource development area that John Horgan put a little bit more emphasis into, but I don't know if that's a fair sort of analysis based on the very early days. Do you get any read on what makes him different from Horgan that way?
Well, I think what makes him different is he's been through a leadership contest where this was, a very potent wedge issue that I think that the Horgan government wasn't as worried about in 2018. I think when they went ahead with this, I think they thought it was going to be a slam dunk for folks that are concerned about resource jobs and see the benefit of, what they say is a transition fuel. I think EB is sort of, trying to walk a fine line here. Like I said, NDP has kind of boxed themselves in, and the Premier and most of his cabinet did vote for the tax package that made the first phase of LNG possible. So it's part of his record already. And there's not a lot of tools that he has other than, something like a stop work order to actually stop the project, because those approvals are there. It was interesting to hear him this week try to put blame on the Liberal government, saying that they were the ones who had issued the initial permits for the project, when, he, of course, voted for those tax breaks that actually made the company go ahead with it. So I think he's, still kind of more aware of the political risks on sort of like the green flank, both from the Greens and also from the Green wing of the NDP itself. But I don't know if we know enough yet to see if he's really going to be different when it comes to making those hard decisions. There's some other projects, Cedar LNG and some other, First Nations projects that are being pushed quite heavily on LNG. And so, it's going to be a really interesting one to see where he goes when it comes time to make those decisions.
I noticed that line too, where he said, the previous government the Liberal government had approved LNG Canada in 2014 on the permits. It used to be a time when the NDP would never say that. They took all the credit as if they had single-handedly pushed LNG into reality, and they did. They offered that tax break, but now it's the Liberals' problem, which to me, I agree with you, Jillian. I think that told us a lot about how he feels about a project that he's going to pretend the NDP had nothing to do with. Allie, let's bring you in. What do you make of all this?
I think we absolutely do know how the NDP government feels about the LNG Canada project, and just about LNG generally. Jillian, you alluded to the Cedar LNG decision. We haven't heard very much about it. And Chief Crystal Smith, in the last few weeks, has also just been reminding the government that they're waiting. So it's very indicative of where they're at with that. I also just think that there are two points of view about LNG and just the industry in general. There's the economic benefits. Of course, it's the largest private investment in Canadian history. In British Columbia, there have been $3.8 billion in contracts awarded through LNG Canada. These are significant for families all over BC. But then when it comes to the environmental impact, the conversation this week has been, well, are those lines going to go to northwestern BC so that we can electrify? And this stalemate of, well, who's going to budge first, the company or government? Well, what's at risk here? Our environment's actually at risk. So I don't think that it's solely an economic conversation. It's a climate conversation, and no one wins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if we're going to electrify the province, you got to build the transmission lines to get the electricity there to what would be the single biggest polluter in BC. Jeff, what do you think?
Wow, lots to unpack here. Allie is completely right about the benefits of LNG Canada. And let's remember that while Liberals talked about getting the job done, it was the NDP that did get it across the finish line. And that is something that John Horgan did as a premier and will deliver billions of fiscal benefits for BC, for schools and hospitals. There's 3,400 people working on site today on that project. What we're talking about right now, there's no brief or decision paper on the Premier's desk about a second phase of LNG Canada. It is still at this stage a mostly hypothetical project. And what we are seeing happening in the North now, and no one's talked about the other big industrial group that's in the middle of this, and that's BC Hydro. And there's right now active negotiations between BC Hydro and LNG Canada, very, very early stages, about how you build electricity infrastructure to meet the needs of not just LNG Canada second phase, but also all sorts of other industrial activity that's happening in that part of the province. And we are a long, long way from more LNG decisions. And probably the silliest thing for Premier EB to do at this stage is to jump in the middle of these early stage negotiations between the people who have the talks over how we build infrastructure and what that looks like. At this stage, I would say that reckless political intervention into those kinds of talks could cost BC Hydro shareholders, that is, all of us, substantial sums of money, and that's not in anyone's interest. And let's be clear about what any future phases of LNG in British Columbia will mean. They can only proceed. They've not been green lighted. They can only proceed if they fit in under BC's greenhouse gas emission targets. So it's a bit of a red herring to say that the project's going to proceed and there's going to be all of this natural gas, greenhouse gas emissions when there is no universe with an NDP government where an LNG plant or any other industrial or anything gets built if it blows up our climate targets. And that's a commitment the Premier has made and one that they will hold fast to.
I'm not a lawyer, full disclosure. I play one on TV, but I'm not a lawyer. I don't think the government can stop them. They're permitted to do it. I'm not sure, there's a climate plan. It's a plan. I'm not sure that the government has the ability to say you can't build something within a certain amount of GHGs. I assume that would be a gigantic court case. The other point I'm just going to bring up there, this idea, and I've heard the New Democrats say this, that there's no decision yet. Well, all of the tax breaks that were offered by the two previous governments came before there was a decision, because you have to give the company the certainty of the deal before they invest billions of dollars in a final investment decision. So the Premier wants to make this argument that, well, there's no final investment decision yet, but you have to offer the deals before in order to get the final investment decision. I remember sitting through a long technical briefing with the John Horgan administration outlining the tax breaks before there was a positive FID, because that's the only way you get to a positive FID. And if they plan to electrify the second phase, you offer that electricity before they get to the FID. Otherwise, it's too late. And that timeline, it's the same government. It knows the timeline.
Yeah, and just to, you raise a good point. The work on the financial package is done, but the discussions over, and this is where you see what the discussions happening between BC Hydro and LNG Canada. LNG Canada is saying you need to commit to electrification before we even consider doing it, and BC Hydro is saying to them, you need to make a commitment to actually making the investment before we will build it into our plans. And so that's the discussion that's happening, and I don't see any value in the Premier getting in the middle of those unless those folks in those discussions can't figure it out.
Well, I think the value would probably be, and just hypothetically, the Premier saying we either support this expansion or we don't, so that these 5 multi-billion-dollar companies know whether they should even bother doing it, and we're willing to do it or we're not. We'll figure out who pays for it.
But then BC Hydro loses all its leverage in the negotiations, and it's going to end up costing us more money, and it's going to raise our hydro bills. And so that's why it's good in my view, it's good for him to keep quiet for now.
There was really interesting, a poll years ago that said that the average Canadian would be willing to spend about 20% more if it was good for the environment. And so when we talk about these investments and when we talk about our investment as taxpayers and as Canadians, we have to also contribute to this conversation as well. By the Premier not saying anything, he is saying a lot in, well, what's our investment into the industry? And then what are we signaling to investors? And this continues to be the conversation, that we just keep pushing investors out of this province.
I think, there's a finite amount of electricity. There is, and I think the government has to make very strategic choices. I think, what he could say is we are going to support electrification of truly clean industries. Expanding this means more fracking, more production of natural gas. I think, saying that they're going to prioritize first true renewables and projects that really support true clean energy is something that he could do and would make a strong statement to that point.
Yeah, and just really, really quickly, he could say, we're going to invest our energy dollars into green hydrogen for example. That's a net zero technology when it's done the right way. And if you spend all of your money on a bad deal that you've negotiated badly because you've had political intervention that gives one side all of the leg up, then you limit your ability to invest in other clean tech, and we don't want to do that.
Sure. I mean, one person's political intervention is another person's, political confidence to investors, but it's the 6 of one, half dozen of the other, I guess. I'll note my colleague Vaughn Palmer from the Vancouver Sun pointed out that BC Hydro had considered a transmission line to the Northwest in 2013 and decided not to go forward with it. Had it done that, conceivably this would be a moot point, although I'm sure LNG Canada would have another kind of, power play move. Maybe you could even electrify the whole thing, which would have been a fascinating discussion as well. But the same argument came up at that time about keeping rates low for BC Hydro ratepayers and not investing in something that could go over budget and come back and raise your electricity rates in Victoria or Vancouver, and people would go, what the heck? I don't even know where this transmission line is going. Why is it more expensive to run my washer and dryer? And so that political dynamic from a decade ago is still echoing through some of the decisions that are occurring now. So interesting. This topic, I think, is fascinating because it raises, as Jeff's pointed out, the government's intention versus a company's ability to invest, and the climate plan and its teeth in terms of stopping things. Can it stop things that are already permitted? All sorts of fascinating kind of angles. We haven't talked about LNG in a while, and I think the government has some big decisions to make there as well. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast edition of Political Capital, because we have a whole nother discussion here about several other topics. But for those of you who are watching the show this week, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the panel for their insights as always. Make sure you subscribe. You can also watch us on Check Plus, and we will be back next week with all the latest here on Political Capital.